Art came first. So I shone at school as in terms of drawing and painting. And so I was quickly whisked off to the Willoughby Workshop Arts Centre in Sydney. And then I went to John Olsen's Bakery Art School in Paddington. And he was fantastic, a wonderful teacher. And he eventually gave it up, of course, because he gave so much of himself. But his passion and enthusiasm and his interest in what I did was a turning point. And I had to make a decision. Would I become an independent visual artist and paint and draw for the rest of my life? Or would I go into theatre? Because I was also interested in theatre. And my mother was very interested in theatre, so I was exposed to it from early childhood. So I eventually decided I would go into the theatre because the course was only 2 years at NIDA, whereas the course at East Sydney Tech was like 5 years. And I thought, oh, I don't want to be in an institution for 5 years. So when I told John this, he was horrified, absolutely horrified, because he thought theatre was a bastardised art form. It wasn't pure, and that I was throwing a great opportunity away. And so I got very confused, but nevertheless, I didn't want to be in institutions for too long. So I went to NIDA. And also I thought I could see a career path there. And indeed, I did. I took off immediately, and I've had a substantial career in the theatre. However, there have been stops. And the first stop was when I was 26, and I went overseas, and I went to the south of France to a school. It wasn't a school, it was a studio that John Olsen recommended, and we maintained contact. And I think it had changed since he'd been there. I would call it the Hat and Banana School, because they'd put a hat there and a banana or a nude or whatever, and you put it on the page. And so it was the look and put school. And I told him that afterwards, and he thought that was very funny, but he wasn't surprised. And so I went my own way, and I found this fantastic place in the south of France, as opposed to the studios, the more academic studios in Paris, which is what I was referring to then. So that's the background, the early background. And so I keep coming back to painting and drawing, and now that I'm in my, what shall I say, my older years, I've always promised myself I would come back to it. And during COVID lockdown, there was a great opportunity. And I decided to do this long before COVID, really. But COVID sort of made it really happen. Yeah. And originally the exhibition of all these paintings that are inspired by The Happy Prince and inspired by my experience of designing the ballet and adapting the ballet was to coincide with the Sydney Opera House season. Well, of course, that's not to be. So we managed to move the exhibition forward because the gallery had had some cancellations. So that was really fortunate. So Graeme and I had worked together a long time ago, but on this instance, I was the instigator. So he wanted me to pitch this idea to David and to Nicolette at the ballet. And so it was late 2015 when Graham Swan Lake was on at the Capitol Theatre. And we sat in a cafe, an empty cafe, the three of us, and I went through 10 possibilities, and they all had the common denominator of romance and fantasy. And one by one, they'd be knocked over with David or Nicolette saying, oh, you know, the Royal Ballet have done that, or the San Francisco Ballet have done that. And I was getting very disheartened. And so eventually I got to number 10, which was The Happy Prince. And because I've done The Happy Prince before as a play with actors and puppeteers, so I put it right down the bottom of the list. But that was the one that intrigued them, and they thought, no one's done this. And then they went off and read it, and they came back to cut a long story short. It was a decision. The deal was done. And then it's had hiccups ever since. And the first thing was the budget. When David and Chris Yates, head of production, saw the model here in my studio, which would have been, I guess, 2016, late 2016. Um, they they thought it was great and they loved it. But then when the numbers were done, it was over budget. And whatever else was happening in the following season, they thought they'd better move it for budget reasons. So it was moved another year. I've lost track of the numbers, the years. And then what happened, like just before Graeme was about to start rehearsals in Melbourne, the final rehearsal period, we'd already done a bit of workshopping in Sydney during the Opera House season. He fell ill and he was hospitalised. And so rehearsals were to commence like 2 days later, and that didn't happen. And I also wasn't well, and I had a serious illness too, which I'd kept a secret. And so in a way, it was obviously a blessing in disguise. Not that either of us wanted to be ill, but we're both fine now. But I don't think it would have been ready in, that was January, and this was to be a March opening at the Sydney Opera House. So the fact that that was delayed was a good thing, and gave us the time it needed. And the fact that the swallow flies, there's aerial involved in the production. It's a very complicated piece of theatre. And we did at least open in Brisbane, as you know, and that was a big success. It's the story. It's Oscar Wilde's story. And it's a story that is truly timeless. And it is about love and sacrifice. It's tender, it's beautiful, it's witty, it has social commentary, but at the heart of it is it is a love story, but an unconventional love story, given that one of them's a bird. But it is very timely now because it is about the prince who is a statue. But inside the statue, in our interpretation, lives the soul, the old soul of the prince, who comes out and becomes personified in the form of a dancer in the show. But it is about the disparity between the rich and the poor, which has been heightened, I think, during the pandemic globally. And so it makes The Happy Prince even more relevant. And so I was extra sad that it wasn't something that people could come back after the pandemic and see, because it is a very moving and beautiful story. And it was written in 1888, and it will, in another 100 years, it'll still be just as relevant. Oh, that's very hard. There are many, many, many moments. And I think the moments, just subconsciously, moments have stuck. And because that was in the end of February, that season at QPAC, and when I came back and started to draw and get myself into the mood of making this a gallery experience through paintings, I think those moments, the key moments that from the production, have actually ended up on the page in terms of paintings, which I couldn't have done before the production. And some of the works Graeme has seen, and he called them what did he call it? Cori art. And of course, you know, to an outsider, they wouldn't know what he's talking about, but we know what he means, that there's a lot of movement. There's a lot of movement and colour. I mean, it's a cliche to say colour and movement, isn't it? But I think it's probably true. Interestingly, because I had done The Happy Prince for Theatre of Image, and it ran on and off in Australia and overseas for 16 years, with a cast of 5, not like 55 with the ballet. And that we didn't want to repeat that in any shape or form. So this had to be a whole new concept. And I wouldn't have wanted to repeat it anyway. So this production, I searched for a hook, and I was away at a guest house in Bowral, and it was wet. Every day rained. It was mud and rain, and you never walked out the door. So you were huddled by the fire. And there was a whole lot of books on top of this very high mantelpiece. And I began to think they were so big, there'd be nothing in them. They were props. But when I went to them, they were Winston Churchill's diaries. And what was interesting was they were very personal accounts of the war. And so it affected me. And I thought, well, what about if we set the Happy Prince in 1945 in London at the end of the war? And therefore the statue has greater significance. It becomes a symbol of hope and reconciliation. And so that's where this production began, at that moment, and that connection. No, I didn't set out to tell the story. I just set out to make pictures, sort of a stream of consciousness, make pictures that were affected by the story and the production that we'd worked on. And it just evolved into a narrative and reflected the actual story itself. And once I became aware of that, and I was like 2/3 into it, and I wasn't doing it in any chronological order. I think that would have been a big mistake. I was jumping all over the place. It was a case of what images came into my mind. You know, I'd see leaves blowing in the street and I'd think, oh, the reed.
Yeah.
That leaf motif's interesting. I'll go there. So there were outside influences in my day-to-day life that helped direct which way I went with the pieces. But as it's turned out, it is a narrative, and you can go through the exhibition and the story is being told, and the combination of the picture and the caption next to it gives you that. So 26 pictures that actually reflect the story. I think you learn to plan and select, and even though what's on the paper might look spontaneous and it's got a free-flowing rhythm, it's actually been planned, and I think that's the skill of a real artist. I think that's something I actually, going right back to John Olsen, I learnt with him, because as you know, his work is very free and spontaneous and calligraphic, but you know, it's all thought through. And the other person that was influential was Arthur Boyd, because Arthur Boyd became the patron of my company, Theatre of Image, when I did a small chamber work that accompanied his retrospective exhibition many years ago at the Art Gallery of New South Wales. That discipline, in terms of visual arts, I think came from those influences. And in my own work, I think there has to be that practical side as well as the artistic side. You need the pragmatic side, the balance. Yeah. I think because I've worked so many years in theatre, and when I design a show, if it's just impressions and finding the atmosphere for the show, and then into the costume designs, you're working on smaller pieces of paper. You're not working on large pieces of paper because you are on a deadline. So, you know, it's a luxury to do what I've done for this exhibition, and I've enjoyed it enormously. And I think it's taken me back to my roots, as I said earlier. And the mediums I use are mediums that I've used throughout my career. I've used oil paint, I've used acrylic paint, but I do feel the transparency of watercolour and inks, good quality, beautiful inks, and crayons, Caran d'Ache crayons in particular. It is is the right medium to interpret the imagery. I always choose a medium that is going to be most suited to what you're trying to say. And with The Happy Prince, there's a sense of beauty, and the word that's used most often when people have seen the designs or these paintings, those few who've seen them, like David or Graeme, is beauty, beautiful. Well, the difference between being an independent artist and waking up and going into your studio every day and putting a mark on a piece of paper or a canvas is, and it's the same as a writer, is the difference with working in the performing arts is you're working with other people. It's a collaboration and there's a camaraderie. You're all on the same train and you're all heading towards an outcome and a deadline. Visual artists, I think, who work their whole life as a singular art form, it's difficult. I mean, they're both difficult for different reasons, because obviously you have to find soulmates to work with collaboratively, and sometimes you think they're soulmates and they turn out not to be, and so you think, well, won't work with that person again. Because it's chemistry, like any relationship. It's like a marriage, whatever. And I think, to be honest, if you work, given what I've done, and the fact that my work crosses over between the performing arts and the visual arts, has given me a bigger appetite and a greater understanding of the arts in general. The picture behind me is the epilogue in the story. In our ballet, The Happy Prince, it represents that. So I found this, I did actually leave this picture to the end of my process of working towards the exhibition. And I left it to the end because I wasn't really sure what to do with it. And I guess it's the sum of the parts. And what it is, it's a sunny, beautiful beach environment, but it's ethereal, it's magical, and within the sun is the prince and the swallow, who are indicated moving within that sphere. And in the story, they go to heaven. And so after all the good deeds that have been done, where the swallow has given the prince's precious jewels to the poor, they are reunited in heaven. And so we didn't want to make our heaven religious. We wanted to make it a place of joy and beauty and happiness and freedom. So it's a new world. This image is the prince and the swallow, the little swallow, who's frozen and about to die. The prince is by now blind, having donated his sapphire eyes to the poor, to the match girl, and to the artist. So this is a really poignant and beautiful moment, but it's also a moment that's uplifting, because they are rewarded for their generosity and their good deeds, and they end up in a heavenly paradise. In the book, Oscar Wilde's line is, "Will you kiss me on the lips, little swallow, for I love you?" And it's a heartfelt moment. I think in terms of my art, I am being highly stimulated by this process, and I think of doing all these paintings for this exhibition. I think it's my nature to always have to have a deadline, because that's will make you do it, and you plan. Otherwise, I might waste a lot of time, and that's because of theatre, performing arts is all based upon strict deadlines. So as I really don't know what the next theatre project is, I mean, there's a couple of things in the wind, but no one knows when they'll go on, and they're early stages anyway, because they're in development. They're not even There are scripts, there are ideas, but also the unknown. So one has to be self-sufficient and think, well, what can I do in the meantime? And I feel that every day is precious, and one has to, if you're given a gift, you've got to use it. And so I have got an idea, and I think because of my work in the theatre, I will always look upon it as a show. So an exhibition is a show. Artists talk about them as being shows, but I see it as being possibly another story. So I take a story and reinterpret it through visual means. And often they might be stories that I've visited as a director and designer in the past. So one of those that does always come up in my head is A Midsummer Night's Dream. So that may be the next, who knows?